Sometimes your users get themselves into danger. Other times you just want to share with them some success. Let's mash on that.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Asp.Net Monsters. In today's episode we're going to talk about alerting, specifically how we can set up a great service to do it within Bootstrap.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago I did this post on Bootstrap 3 and I believe it was MVC 4 at the time, just with a little way to kind of leverage some of the framework components and kind of tie things together with the Bootstrap alerts. And so if I do a little Google search here for some Bootstrap alert stuff, Bootstrap alert, and I'm going to do V3 because that's what ships with the template. But I'll just mention it's the way that we're going to approach this today. We're going to be able to really kind of like you'll be able to swap out the template and make any of the changes. It's very trivial changes that we need to make, but V3 is what ships with the template right now in Asp.Net Core MVC, so that's what I've gone with. So we can have a look at an alert, and all it is something that's you can pop up at the top of the page, let the user know that something's happened or there was an error, or maybe that they need to check something else, maybe follow up on something, or just pass along some info. So it's a pretty common pattern. There's a dismissible feature here as well. So as you can see, I just clicked that X and that just goes away. This does require the JavaScript plugin, but again, JavaScript is included in the Bootstrap.js library is actually included in the default install and template as well. So that's kind of what we're trying to do, and what we kind of want to accomplish is the user is taking some action on the site, and at some point something comes to pass, and we want to either confirm or give an error message that something went wrong, and we want to get this information up to it. So if you're using Bootstrap, this is kind of the de facto way to make this happen. So what I've done here, if I'll just close all of these guys down, and I've got a little bit of a progression that we can walk through. So in my first version, a couple of things. First of all, temp data is something that, depending on how far back you go, was a default and then was no longer a default, and in terms of being enabled in your application. And then it became something that you had to go fishing for in order to make it work and add packages from NuGet and then track down the right configuration steps and all of those things. As of .NET 2.1, of ASP.NET Core 2.1 and the templates that they've got, the packages are actually already referenced for you, but you do need to do a couple of pieces of wiring. So the first thing I've done is I've gone into my startup.cs and I've added session state temp data provider. If you are doing this is fine for things that are small little snippets. Now, because what we're doing is simply a collection of strings is what it boils down to, this is going to work for us. And the session state temp data provider requires a couple of things. First of all, we have to add session, and then we also have to use session when we do our configuration for our app. So we've got a number of episodes on services and configuration, so check those out if you're not sure what this means. But what's important is to use session before we use MVC. Otherwise, this is a terminal routing inside the application, so everything that you put after use MVC is likely not going to happen unless you run into an error and find some other funky way down past it. But this will actually consume all requests. So use session
So that's
first.
session stuff if we're on a, I'm going to use the term web farm here, but that's totally not the right word. So if you're distributed across a number of different machines, then you have to have some sort of a shared session server for this?
Correct. So there's packages available for that, and as well you can opt out if you've got small enough pieces of data. You can use cookies instead. So they actually have a temp data provider for cookies, and provided it's not sensitive data, or you've got the encryption things in check to make sure that you're not that data is not crossing the wire unencrypted, then you're probably fine to use the cookie approach without having to worry about the server farm configuration aspects of it. But there are packages in place for that as well, for managing session across machines. Great question. Okay, so with that in place, our temp data is configured. Now, why are we using temp data? Temp data is like this scratch pad that we've got, and we can dump a piece of information to it, and the next time the user makes a GET request, then the temp data will be hydrated back into that user's context, into that user session. So this is important because it gives us a one-off opportunity without having to persist something to a database, without having to do any custom coding inside the framework. We get this kind of like scratch pad area where we can dump this information, and it's a good use for temp data. Is a good, like, alerts are a good use of temp data. Effectively, you know, the user's made a they've made a change to a record or something. They've saved it to the database. You want to say, hey, we saved it. That it was a success, and you want to kind of move on. So what I've done is in my controller, all I've done is said temp data. I'm calling it alert. It's a key value pair, and in this case, I'm just dropping a string in, and it says this is the alert, and then we're going to write it in. And then just a simplistic, naive approach, all I'm doing is going into my index here, and I say if the temp data contains a key called alert, then let's draw this alert on screen. And so as you can see, the Bootstrap alert is pretty simple to implement. And even though these classes may change in future versions, this is a really easy thing that you'd be able to update down the road. So let's just have a quick look at what that does. So again, the home controller is adding a key and an entry to the temp data. That is wired up for us in our startup services, which we had a look at by adding the session state, temp data provider, adding session, and then using session. So our services are there and they're being used by the applications pipeline. And then finally, in our view, we check to see if the temp data contains that key for the alert, and then we render it. So I'll just do a quick little run here, and we see this is the alert. And just so that we know it's not something taken out of the prestige, I will go in and say here, howdy. And we'll run that again, and of course our browser will pop up at some point. Maybe if I push the right buttons. And I think I have a compilation error. I'm not sure what Visual Studio is doing. No. Let me just click clean here.
Turns out it was a prestige.
It was. It says the application's in use. So there's the howdy, so it is changing. Okay, so right off the hop, a couple of problems that we've got with this. First of all, in terms of reusability, we don't have a lot. I had to actually go into my page, into my CS.html, and I had to put this div in here, and I've got a hard-coded, alert success. So what happens if something goes wrong? So am I going to start to do things like alert-success and then have alert.danger, and then I've got 4 of these, and then I have to put them in each of my views? It's kind of not really a pattern that we want to follow throughout our application, and it makes reusing this harder. So what I probably want to do, my first stab at this might be something correcting some of these issues, and I'll just close all these, and I'll move on to V2. And we'll walk through what I've done here. So let me just do startup project. And if you're gonna use this in a couple of places, then maybe this is far enough along. Not really using any framework features, but I'll just demo it again and kind of show our first step in trying to make this more reusable. So first of all, I still have those same things. I'm adding the temp data provider. I'm using sessions. So those still check out. Those are in startup, and you're going to require those regardless of the solution you use. However, in this one, I've taken a little bit of a different approach, and I've just added a features folder, and I've added a class called alert. In there I've got a constant called temp data key, and I've got a static class here containing some constants in it for the different types of styles that I might be using, and I'm going to use those to kind of direct the alert, the CSS. I'm going to try and use those to kind of indicate what I want to push my message out as. And so I've got also a flag in here called dismissible. So that was one of the other things that was missing from the first approach, is that I even though I had the alert in there, I may or may not want the alert to be dismissible, but that wasn't there. Here's a message, and then here's the style. So basically wrapping up the different options that we've got for the alert and putting it into a C# class that I can use. Now, in this first approach, what I've done is the way that I did it before, back in the old MVC framework on ASP.NET, on .NET Framework 4.6. So what I had was an alertable controller, and this actually works fairly well. The idea is that much like you have like an OK message or whatever the case may be, I just added these success, information, warning, and danger that just uses a private internal method here to modify the temp data on the controller, just like I was doing in that first version of the home controller, but now I've got it into this base controller that I'm going to inherit from. And I can add the alert, and then it checks to see if the alert list is there. If it is, it pulls it out of temp data, and then it starts to add alerts. And the nice thing about this is maybe I was able to save the record to the database, but for some reason I got an error when I was trying to clear the cache. So I could actually display both messages and add them to the alerts and let the user know, giving them an option perhaps even to attempt to clear the cache in another way or whatever the case may be. Not really my concern in the alert controller, alertable controller. So again, what I do is I just add that to the collection, and then I set, based on that temp data key, the list data in there. And then new again in 2.1 or returning in 2.1, the temp data behind the scenes, temp data will actually serialize these objects again for me. So when ASP.NET Core came out, and you've probably, if you've used temp data at all, you would have run into this, but it only accepts strings as eligible entries for the dictionary. It was a string dictionary. And previously we had a string object, so we could put whatever we wanted into there. So I had to, like in any of my stuff that was on Core 1.0.1.1, stuff and whatever the other versions were, I had to actually serialize my list to JSON and then deserialize it on the way out. We no longer have to do that though. As of 2.1, by default out of box, the package will actually serialize the object for us. Okay, so now with an alertable controller in place, I take a little bit of a different approach on my home controller, and I say that this is an alertable controller, and then I've just added a few in here. So I've got a success, I've got a danger that is dismissible. So I did, in my alertable controller, you can see I have a default value of false for the parameter dismissible. I'm going to use that to drive my template when I render the alert. And that's pretty much it. I'm just able to then do something like success or danger or whatever. Again, if you had something that was like a public eye action result and it was edit and you accepted some kind of object which was your model, and you were doing something like return view after everything checked out, you could say something like if model state dot is valid, then you could do a success, it worked. Otherwise, actually, do you know what would be interesting here is if this is in a post scenario, and you needed to do, like, you wanted to follow the post redirect get pattern, then we would be able to do that here. So we could redirect to action, and then et cetera, and do the things that we needed to do. So this is where this comes in handy, is I can do a success out there, but down here I could do the danger. Just put in bay here, as suggested by a funny chap I know. So we can take that approach, and that's how we would kind of integrate that in a post redirect get pattern. So this is really nice because either way we can send an alert back to the user. So I'll just blow that out of there.
So the temp data survives that redirect to another action? It
does, because it is only hydrated to the context on get. So you can do puts and posts and everything, and it's fine. When you do the redirect to the user, it's the completion of a post, and on the redirect, the browser is going to fetch another get request, and that's going to be where the temp data comes back. And so we get to work with it in the context at that point.
So do you need to clear the temp data between requests, or do you run the risk of like showing a bunch of alerts from stuff that was done a day ago?
If they did a bunch
it clears out on the next request, right?
It clears out on the next get request,
okay.
And it would also clear out on the end of your session because it's tied to your session. So I haven't seen a place where I've run into that. It's it's because it's tied to session. It's not cross user, so you don't run into problems with like a user seeing someone else's. It is session safe.
Right. So it's temporary for like the transaction that is happening right now.
Correct.
Basically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the thing is, like, one thing that you will get caught on is if you do a get and then the result of that get returns a redirect, you've lost your temp data.
Okay.
So you have to evaluate it on the next get. Otherwise, it'll just get eaten by the framework. So okay. So moving on. So now I've got in my controller, in my home controller, I'm inheriting from alertable controller. And what I've done here is I've just thrown a few different alerts on the screen. And I'll try and run it again, and we're successful. And there we have, this is the alert, much whoops and so whoops, and here this one is dismissible. So I'll close that down, and what I'll show you is how we approach this a little bit differently in the view. So taking a more MVC type approach in shared, I have layout, and in my layout, just ahead of my body, I am dumping this, I just basically go for each alert and alerts, and I actually should clarify, I'm pulling my alerts out of the temp data up here. Now, this is now affecting my layout. So we've got some inherent problems with it, but again, as a first step in trying to move through how you might approach this, this may be somewhere where you end up. The problem that I have with this approach is that it's requiring me to go and edit my layout, which is not really concerned with rendering alerts. Like, I mean, if we're trying to separate concerns, it's not the right place for it. So one approach that you could take is you could go and move this out into, for example, a partial view, and then just render the partial view inside of your layout. And that's probably a little bit better, but it's also not Asp.Net Core MVC-ish, because we've got some new things that we can do inside of Asp.Net Core. However, we'll just look at this code here, and I've got it separated out into this partial. It's a little bit easier to see here. All the code's in one place. So basically, I'm pulling that temp data out and getting it back as I'm casting it to a list of alerts. And then I check to see if it's dismissible. I tie that into my class specification here for my CSS. Say my div is alert. It's an alert of the style for the current alert, which is what allows me to add those multiples as I iterate over it. I can use the style that's kind of been set for me by that base controller. And then I can, if it's dismissible, it will actually render a button that follows the pattern required for the JavaScript and CSS framework from Bootstrap. And then finally, I do an HTML raw alert message. The reason why I do this is because this is just one way that you could do it, but in this case I can say, you know, strong/strong Will Robinson, which is also funny. And then
Thanks for calling that out.
yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure. And then that will be, I'd still be able to render those things in there. It lets me do links and stuff like that. There's always inherent danger in rendering raw content to a page, so just make sure that you're not doing something that would, say for example, result in some kind of script injection attack or something like that. I don't know anyone who does that. Okay, so that is our next approach. So first one, we're kind of baking it into the controller and the view. It's kind of rigid. Second one, we get a little bit more powerful, a little bit more reusable, but it's starting to affect things. I have to, you know, I'm forced to use this controller approach, inheriting from it. And then, I mean, it could be part of my base controller, but then that means that my base controller is now getting really bloated and harder to test and all of those things. So I want to take a different kind of approach to it. So let's go to V3. Let's close these down.
Yeah, inheritance is a really strong way of tying classes together. It's a really strong coupling, which generally you want to try and avoid. And I can see scenarios here where you want to mix and match different bits, and because C# doesn't support multiple inheritance, thank goodness.
Yeah.
There's no way to inherit from multiple places.
Exactly. So what I did in this approach then is I kept my same base level features for the alert class and the alert styles. What I like about this approach is that, much like using view models and things like that, you have the ability to just use the class in other places and make updates to it and very easily have these things componentized and segregated so that we don't have to modify other things. But I changed my approach and I started using a service instead. Now I've called this an alert service. What I'm doing here is I'm taking an HTTP context accessor and a temp data dictionary factory. These are framework components that exist in the default install. I didn't have to add any packages for this. But this is how I get my temp data now. So my temp data dictionary, which I was just accessing directly as an inherited controller, or as part of the inherited controller, I'm now just turning that into a private variable that I look up when my class gets started. And now when I call my add alert, I'm just accessing that private member variable, which is actually retrieved through the temp data generator, the factory, and with the HTTP context from the framework, so from the request pipeline. So that settles that for me, so that I've got that separation. I don't have to worry about the inheritance thing. Now, that does require me to do a simple configuration change as well. First of all, I had to add the HTTP context accessor, otherwise it would not be injected for me. The other thing that I had to do is add a singleton for my alert service so that my dependencies would be resolved for me when I request the alert service in other aspects of my application. So,
is a singleton service safe there? Do we want the same instance of the alert service for every request?
No, we can do transient, or transient's probably best, I guess, eh? What else could we do? Add scope.
You scope the request.
Yeah, I mean, we could scope it to the request. Yeah, that probably makes the most sense because it's only going to be for the life of that request anyways. Yeah, good catch. I think that was an autocomplete move on kind of thing really quickly, so wonderful. Now I'll go to my controller, and the nice thing about my controller now is it's still just a controller, or still just a base controller if you wanted to use one in your application. But the difference being that I'm going to inject an alert service, and then I can just call that alert service by calling the same way we were doing it before from the base controller, but I'm just calling the .danger instead of danger as a method on my base class. So
it's good, James. I much prefer this approach to adding behavior to a controller. It's a lot cleaner and easier to test and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
yeah. I agree. So now when I run this guy, and then a couple of other things. Well, let's run it, and I'll just show you that it's working. Because I didn't want to stop there and just say, well, now I'm Asp.NET Core MVC and I'm all happy. But it's my middle name, and I've got it dismissible, and that's all good. So let me close that down, or dismiss it, and then that goes away, and I'll close that down. And then finally, what I wanted to show you was that in my view, in my layout, rather than having code in place here or using partial view, I decided to render a view component as with a tag helper. So there's a view component tag helper that I can just call into alerts. And in order to enable this, we had to do a couple more things. So what I wanted to show here was that the alerts, I can actually pull them out as part of my, as part of the invoke async, pull the alerts out, and then return that and pass the alerts as part of the model to my view component. So this is even getting a little bit further down the path, rather than going into my my alert up here and into my view component here, and you'll remember in this kind of model, I was getting the alerts from the temp data, so now I'm manipulating temp data in my view. Rather than doing that, I wanted to instead inject the list of alerts as the model, and then just use the framework as much as possible to kind of do the right things, quote unquote. Now, I still capture whether or not it's dismissible, and then I render out my alerts, and pretty much the rest of this is the same, but now it's a view component that's stored outside, and I simply have to register it in my view imports. I'm looking at the wrong project. So I'll look at my view imports, and I'm just pulling in any of the available tag helpers. This just registers my view component, ensures that it's registered as a tag helper. So. And that's kind of pretty much the premise of it. So now in my layout, I just simply have this view component call, and that's all I need. I'm injecting a service into my controller, I'm doing adding a view component, and then the really nice thing about this is, as a service and a view component, and a couple of startup pieces, what I can do now is I can actually just wrap this all up into a package and make it available on NuGet so that anybody else could use it.
So when will that be available?
After it proofs.
That's good stuff. I really like it.
Okay.
Yeah, me too.
So much
Right on.
cleaner approach.
Yeah. Cool. So that's kind of the gist of it. Shout out to John, who suggested revisiting this in a new fashion. He was actually one of my readers of my first book in which I covered this topic, and kind of recommended kind of taking another whack at it for Asp.NET Core and the MVC framework out here. So thanks, John, for the suggestion, and I think we need to send John some stickers. What do you guys think? They do make the laptop go faster, right? Yeah. Yeah, so I've got some stickers still here on my desk somewhere, so I will track those down, and we will track down John and send some stickers out to him.
Sounds good.
Cool.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you for listening, and remember to like, comment, and share. And if you leave a comment, we'll read it. If we read it on air, we'll send you a sticker. If you suggest a show topic and we do it, we'll send you stickers for that too, apparently.
Yeah, we will. Hey,
So-
and we're on YouTube now, right? So we need to be asking people,
Yes.
subscribe.
Oh, that's the thing that
Yes.
people do on YouTube, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
We have to pretend
Okay.
like we're all jiggy with it out here. So we have to
Oh,
we have
gosh.
to learn the lingo and stuff, and people are going to need to subscribe.
Okay. Yeah, we could do that. I'm not going to any forests in Japan for this podcast, though.
No, do not.
No. Okay.
That will get us into trouble.
Rightfully so.
Awesome. Thanks very much, guys, and thanks everyone for watching.
All right. See you
Thanks.
later.